What happens when old power meets quiet defiance across a table worth billions? In the hushed golden marble dining hall of the Pacific Union Club, San Francisco's most exclusive restaurant, history was about to be rewritten, though no one at table 12 knew it yet. Before we begin, let me know in the comments section where you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe and like this video. The air didn't just smell expensive, it felt choreographed. Crystal chandeliers dripped light onto velvet walls, and the waiters moved like ghosts, silent and invisible. This was where reputations were traded for profit, and the language of money drowned out everything else. At the head of the table sat Isabella Zhang, the only daughter of a Chinese empire built on art, technology, and discipline. To the men flanking her, Western financiers with polished smiles and predatory patience, she was a courtesy, a ceremonial figurehead whose signature would seal their victory. They spoke around her, through her, never to her. Every word dripped with condescension disguised as charm. And through it all, Isabella sat perfectly still, as if her silence was just another part of the decor. The air inside the Pacific Union's governor's room was not merely climate-controlled. It was engineered. It tasted of privilege, aged whiskey, and the kind of silence that only comes with generational wealth. Floor-to-ceiling mahogany panels absorbed sound like a confessional, and the chandeliers, each worth more than a year of graduate tuition, bathed everything in a soft, amber glow that made every deal feel inevitable. Heavy brocade drapes the color of old wine blocked out the fog and chaos of the San Francisco streets below, creating a kind of airlock between the real world and this one. This was not a place where ordinary people ate. It was a place where legacies were carved up and redistributed over white truffle risotto and bottles of Bordeaux that cost more than most people's mortgages. Tonight, Table 9, the corner alcove reserved for the club's most sensitive negotiations, was the stage for such a carving. Isabella Zhang felt the weight of the room like a hand pressing on her chest. On paper, she was the most powerful person at the table. As the only child of Zhang Tian, the visionary founder of Zhang Innovations, her name alone commanded respect in Beijing, Singapore, and London. The company's fusion of classical Chinese art archives and cutting-edge AI had made it a billion-dollar crown jewel. Her approval was the only thing standing between this dinner and a done deal. In reality, she was invisible. A beautifully dressed, Oxford-educated ghost. She had been allowed to attend this final signing dinner, the way one might allow a child to sit at the adults' table during the holidays, seen, but not heard. Her father's stroke 6 months ago had thrown the board into chaos. The vultures circled. And Ashbridge Capital, led by the infamous Richard Ashbridge, had come in with an offer too aggressive to be anything but hostile. Across the starched white linen sat the architects of her dispossession. At the head was Richard Ashbridge himself, a man carved from cold pragmatism and unchecked entitlement, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, the kind of investor who spoke about modernization the way colonizers once spoke about civilization. Beside him sat his son, Evan Ashbridge, younger, smugger, slouched in his chair like he'd already won. They had been talking for 40 minutes. Not once had either man addressed Bella directly. And across the room, refilling water glasses with the practiced invisibility of someone who had learned to disappear, stood Grace Lynn. She moved through the governor's room like smoke, efficient, polite, forgettable. The kind of person powerful men never remembered, even when she stood 2 feet away. But Grace saw everything. She saw the way Bella's hands trembled slightly as she gripped her napkin. The way her jaw tightened every time Richard Ashbridge used the word restructure. The way Evan smirked into his bourbon when his father made a thinly veiled joke about tradition slowing down progress. Grace had spent years being underestimated. She knew the look. She knew the feeling. And tonight, for reasons she couldn't yet name, she couldn't look away. Sometimes, the quietest person in the room is the one holding the truth no one wants to hear. And sometimes, that truth doesn't whisper. It shatters. But to understand how 2 invisible women would topple an empire before dessert was served, you have to go back 6 months, to the day Bella's world broke, and the day Grace's brilliance was buried alive. 6 months earlier, Isabella Zhang had stood in her father's hospital room and made a promise she didn't know how to keep. Zhang Tian, once a force of nature, a man who could code in 3 languages and recite Tang Dynasty poetry from memory, lay motionless beneath sterile white sheets. The stroke had stolen his voice, but not his eyes. And those eyes, sharp and pleading, had looked at his daughter as if to say, "Don't let them erase us." The us wasn't just family. It was philosophy. Zhang Tian had built Zhang Innovations on a radical belief that technology without culture was soulless, and culture without innovation was extinct. Every algorithm the company developed was rooted in classical Chinese art theory. Every design interface borrowed from calligraphy, balance, the ancient principle of Lu Bai, the power of empty space. Her grandfather had started it in a Shanghai workshop in 1924, preserving scrolls and porcelain during wars and revolutions. Her father had digitized it, transformed it, globalized it. And now, men like Richard Ashbridge wanted to strip mine it for profit and get everything that made it sacred. To the board, the merger was survival. To Bella, it was surrender. She sat now in her father's San Francisco office, her office technically, though it still smelled like his jasmine tea and old leather, staring at a speech she'd written and rewritten 17 times. Zhang Innovations has always believed that heritage is not a limitation, it is a lens. The words felt hollow. She'd never get to say them. Richard Ashbridge didn't do speeches. He did signatures. He'd made that clear in their last call, his voice dripping with the kind of paternalism that made her skin crawl. "We're not here to argue philosophy, Miss Zhang. We're here to save a sinking ship." Her ship. Her family's ship. And she was supposed to smile and hand over the wheel. Bella leaned back, exhaustion pooling in her bones. She'd been raised to be gracious, composed, humble, all the virtues that made Eastern daughters beloved and Western boardrooms dismiss you as soft. She spoke 4 languages fluently, held degrees from Oxford and Tsinghua, could debug code and authenticate Ming Dynasty porcelain with equal precision. None of it mattered. Because she didn't speak the language these men respected most, violence disguised as vision. Across the city, in a cramped studio apartment in the Tenderloin, Grace Lynn stood over an ironing board, steam rising from the black vest she'd wear in 4 hours. The apartment was a study in contrasts. Stacks of academic journals, Linguistic Anthropology Quarterly, the Journal of Sociolinguistics, leaned against grease-stained takeout boxes. A framed PhD from Oxford hung beside a corkboard covered in past-due notices. The ceiling leaked when it rained. The radiator clanked like a dying engine. This was what happened when brilliance met bad timing. 2 years ago, Grace had been Dr. Grace Lynn, a rising star at Oxford's Department of Anthropological Linguistics. Her research focused on endangered Chinese dialects preserved in private family archives, particularly the Zhang family's collection, one of the most comprehensive in the world. She'd been months from publishing a landmark paper. The university had promised her a permanent lectureship. Then Ashbridge Capital acquired the hedge fund that sponsored Oxford's East Asian Studies Endowment. Restructuring, they called it. Her program was cut. Her funding evaporated. Her research, years of work, was buried in a filing cabinet somewhere while a consultant named Malcolm Tate, a man who couldn't tell Mandarin from Cantonese, was brought in to assess the commercial viability of the university's cultural assets. 6 months later, she'd lost her work visa sponsorship. She'd come to San Francisco on a student debt payment plan and a tourist visa, working cash jobs until she could figure out what came next. Turns out, next was serving wine to people who wouldn't remember her face. Grace pressed the iron harder than necessary, smoothing a wrinkle that didn't exist. She told herself it didn't matter. That work was work. That pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. But some nights, when she rode the BART home at 1 a.m. smelling like someone else's filet mignon, she wanted to scream. She had been someone. She had mattered. Now she was furniture. That evening, as the San Francisco fog rolled in thick and cold, 2 women prepared. Bella stood in front of her mirror, smoothing down the collar of a tailored Armani blazer the color of midnight. She rehearsed her opening line one more time, even though she knew she'd never get the chance to say it. "Gentlemen, before we sign, I'd like to speak about my father's vision." Her voice cracked. She stopped, took a breath, started again. Miles away, Grace pulled her hair into a tight bun, applied the nude lipstick the club required, and checked her reflection in a bathroom mirror spotted with age. Professional. Forgettable. Invisible. She didn't know that tonight, someone would finally see her. She didn't know that the heiress sitting in that corner alcove would shatter, literally, and that Grace's voice, her real voice, would be the one to catch her. Sometimes fate doesn't announce itself. Sometimes it just shows up with a tray of wineglasses and a language no one else speaks. And sometimes, two invisible women collide, and the whole room has to notice. Dinner arrived like a performance choreographed to humiliate. The first course, seared diver scallops with yuzu foam and microgreens that cost more than Grace's weekly rent, was placed before each guest with ceremonial precision. Richard Ashbridge didn't wait for Bella to lift her fork. He simply began. "Now, Miss Zhang," he said, cutting into his scallop with surgical efficiency, "let's talk about what happens after the signature. We'll need to streamline your cultural division." He said cultural the way one might say ornamental. Beautiful work, of course. But the market doesn't pay for sentiment. Bella's fingers tightened around her fork. "My father built that division to preserve." "Your father," Richard interrupted smoothly, not even looking up, "built a company that's hemorrhaging resources on projects with no ROI. We're here to fix that." Evan Ashbridge, lounging in his chair like a prince at a boring court function, swirled his wine and smirked. "No offense, but the whole art meets algorithm thing? It's nostalgia dressed up as innovation. Collectors want status symbols. Users want speed. No one's paying extra because your UI references some dusty scroll from the 1400s. Bella felt heat rise in her chest. Those dusty scrolls are the foundation of our design philosophy. Every philosophy. Evan laughed, a short, ugly sound. "See, that's the problem. You're running a tech company like it's a museum. Meanwhile, your competitors are eating your lunch." Richard smiled indulgently, as if watching a child defend an imaginary friend. "What Evan means, Miss Zhang, is that we admire your passion. Truly. But passion and profit are different languages." He leaned back, dabbing his mouth with his napkin. "That's why we're here. You provide the legacy, the name, the story. We provide the structure." His eyes glinted. "Think of yourself as a polite face for the paperwork." Something inside Bella cracked. Her hand, reaching for her teacup, delicate porcelain, hand-painted, a gift from her grandmother, began to tremble. She tried to steady it. Tried to summon the composure her father had always modeled, the grace her mother had drilled into her since childhood. But her fingers wouldn't stop shaking. The cup slipped. It struck the edge of the marble table with a sound like a bone breaking, sharp final wrong. Porcelain exploded into a constellation of white shards. Hot tea spread across the linen in a dark branching stain, like blood seeping through gauze. For a moment, no one moved. Then Evan laughed. "Well," he said, grinning, "that's one way to make a statement." Richard's smile was sharper, colder. He tilted his head, studying Bella like a specimen under glass. "Careful, Miss Zhang," he said softly, his voice carrying just enough edge to draw blood. "We'd hate for emotion to stain the balance sheet." The table erupted in polite, vicious laughter. Bella's throat closed. Her vision blurred. She stared at the ruined tea, the shattered porcelain, the spreading stain, and felt something ancient and horrible rise in her chest. Shame. Not for the mistake. For the performance. For sitting here, silent and complicit, while these men dismembered her father's life's work and expected her to smile through it. Under her breath, so quietly no one should have heard. She whispered in Shanghainese, the dialect of her grandmother, her childhood, the language she spoke when she needed to feel safe. Washile mienzi. I have lost face. And then, impossibly, someone answered. Grace had moved so quietly that no one noticed her approach. She knelt beside Bella's chair, a linen napkin in hand, already dabbing at the spill with practiced efficiency. The men at the table barely registered her presence. She was part of the scenery, a shadow with a cleaning cloth. But as she leaned in, close enough that only Bella could hear, she spoke. In perfect, flawless Shanghainese. Ni kiishi diawuzi, don zunyan yong yuen buhue shirtsu. You can wash away a stain, but dignity is never lost. Bella's breath caught. Her eyes snapped down to the woman kneeling beside her, this waitress, this stranger, who had just spoken the language of her ancestors with the precision of a scholar and the tenderness of a friend. Grace's hands stilled over the spill. Slowly, she lifted her gaze. Their eyes met. And in that moment, something shifted. Not loudly. Not violently. But undeniably. Recognition. Not of faces, but of experience. Of being underestimated. Erased. Spoken over and through and around, as if intelligence and dignity were luxuries reserved for men who'd never had to fight for either. Richard frowned, his predator's instinct sensing a change in the room's temperature. What was that? Grace rose smoothly, napkin folded, her expression perfectly neutral. Just asking if Miss Zhang requires anything further, sir. But her voice, calm, clear, unshaken, carried a note that hadn't been there before. Bella straightened in her chair. The tremor in her hands stilled. When she spoke, her voice was no longer apologetic. I'm fine, Bella said quietly. Then, holding Richard's gaze, and I think we should revisit the terms of this conversation. Evan blinked. Excuse me. Richard's smile thinned. Miss Zhang, I'm not sure. I'm sure, Bella interrupted. Her tone was silk over steel. You've spent this entire dinner talking about my company. I think it's time you listened to someone who actually understands it. Grace stepped back, tray in hand, but she didn't leave. She stayed, just outside the circle of light, watching. And for the first time all night, Bella wasn't alone. Sometimes, power doesn't announce itself with a shout. Sometimes, it begins with a whisper in a language the world forgot to fear. Richard Ashbridge set down his wine glass with deliberate precision. The sound, crystal meeting marble, carried the weight of a gavel. I'm sorry, he said, his tone anything but apologetic. Did I miss something? His eyes fixed on Grace with the cold curiosity of a man who just noticed a piece of furniture had moved on its own. What exactly did you say to Miss Zhang? Grace met his gaze without flinching. I asked if she needed water, sir. She seemed unwell. In Chinese. In Shanghainese, Grace corrected gently. Miss Zhang's ancestral dialect. I thought it might be more comfortable for her. The air in the governor's room thickened. Several waitstaff near the service station had stopped moving, their attention drawn to table 9 like moths to a flame that might burn them. Evan leaned forward, eyebrows raised. Our waitress speaks Shanghainese. How cosmopolitan. He said it like a joke, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. Richard wasn't smiling at all. And you just happened to learn an obscure regional dialect? I studied linguistics, Grace replied simply. Shanghainese isn't obscure if you know where to look. Studied. Richard's lips curved into something that might have been amusement. Past tense. Grace's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Yes. Past tense. Bella watched the exchange with something awakening in her chest, something that felt dangerously like hope. She turned to Richard, her voice calm but edged with steel. Tell me, Mr. Ashbridge, do you often mistake silence for submission? Richard's attention snapped back to her. For the first time that evening, He actually looked at her. Saw her. "Excuse me." "You've spent this entire dinner," Bella continued, her words precise and measured, "explaining my own company to me. My family's legacy. My father's vision. As if my presence here were decorative." She tilted her head slightly. "I'm wondering if you thought my silence meant agreement. Or if you simply didn't care either way." Evan's smirk faltered. Richard recovered quickly, his expression smoothing into practiced diplomacy. "Miss Zhang, I think you're misunderstanding our intentions." "Am I?" Bella's eyes didn't waver. "Because from where I'm sitting, your intentions seem remarkably clear." Grace moved to refill water glasses, her movements unhurried, professional. But inside, something was unraveling. Years of it. Years. Of nodding politely while men with half her education explained her own research to her. Of watching grants go to colleagues who cited her work without credit. Of being called sweetheart by undergraduates, too sensitive by department heads, difficult when she asked for what she'd earned. She'd swallowed it. All of it. Choked it down with smiles and thank yous, and the kind of gracious humility that was supposed to make her palatable. Safe. Worth keeping around. And then they'd fired her anyway. Tonight, watching Bella endure that same surgical condescension, the kind that smiled while it cut, Grace felt something inside her shift. Harden. She was done swallowing. Richard pulled a leather folder from beside his chair and extracted a document, sliding it across the table toward Bella. "Perhaps we should focus on the contract. Specifically, Section 7.3, the Cultural Asset Redistribution Clause." Bella reached for the paper, but Grace, in the act of pouring water, glanced down at the exposed text. Her eyes caught on a line. Narrowed. "Forgive me," Grace said quietly. Every head turned. Grace set the water pitcher down with careful deliberacy. "But I believe there's an issue with the translation in that clause." Richard's expression went very still. "I'm sorry." Section 7.3, Grace continued, her voice steady, academic, the voice of Dr. Grace Lin, the one she hadn't used in 2 years. It references the Zhang family's Wenhui Chan as cultural inventory. But Ichan doesn't mean inventory. It means heritage. Legacy. The distinction matters legally. What you've written suggests transferable assets. What it actually describes is inalienable identity. The silence that followed was absolute. Bella's eyes widened. She pulled the document closer, scanning the clause Grace had identified. Her expression shifted from confusion to comprehension to something cold and furious. "She's right," Bella said softly. "This translation, it reclassifies our entire cultural division as liquidatable property." She looked up at Richard. "That's not what we agreed to." Richard's face remained carefully neutral, but a muscle in his jaw twitched. "That's a minor semantic." "No." Bella's voice cut through his like a blade. "It's deliberate. You hired a translator who either didn't understand the language, or understood it perfectly and chose to mislead me." Evan shifted in his seat, suddenly very interested in his wine. Richard leaned back, reassessing. "Miss Zhang, I assure you." "Your assurances," Bella interrupted, her composure now a weapon, "are worth exactly as much as this contract. Which is to say, nothing." Grace felt eyes on her, not just from the table, but from the other staff. A server near the kitchen door was staring. The sommelier had frozen mid-pour at table 3. No one spoke to guests like this. No one interrupted. But Grace had spent 2 years invisible. And invisibility, she was realizing, had given her a strange kind of freedom. What did she have to lose that hadn't already been taken? Richard's smile was gone now, replaced by something sharper. "I think," he said slowly, "we may need to revisit the terms of this discussion." "I think," Bella replied, her voice like silk-wrapped iron, "we may need to revisit whether this discussion continues at all." Evan looked at his father, uncertainty flickering across his face for the first time. Richard's fingers drummed once on the table, a tiny crack in his marble composure. The power in the room hadn't shifted completely, but it had fractured, and everyone could feel it. Grace stepped back, tray in hand, preparing to retreat into the shadows she knew so well. But before she moved, her eyes met Bella's. Just for a second. A look that carried no words but said everything. "I see you. I'm here. This isn't over." Bella's lips curved, not a smile exactly. Something fiercer. She turned back to Richard, her spine straight, her voice clear. "Shall we start again, Mr. Ashbridge? This time with honesty." Sometimes, the fall of an empire doesn't begin with an explosion. It begins with a single crack in glass, and two women who refuse to look away. Richard Ashbridge's composure had been dented, but not broken. He was a man who'd built empires on the bones of better people's work. He knew how to recover from a stumble. He straightened in his chair, his smile returning like a mask snapping back into place. "Well," he said, his tone dripping with condescension, "it seems we have a linguistic expert in our midst." He turned to Grace with the kind of look one might give a performing dog. "Tell me, do all the waitstaff here come with PhDs, or are you just exceptionally overqualified?" A few muffled chuckles from Evan's side of the table. Grace stood perfectly still, tray held at her side, her expression unreadable. Richard leaned forward, fingers steepled. "Seriously, though, who are you, exactly? The Waitress philosopher? The service industry's answer to Confucius?" The mockery was designed to put her back in her place. To remind everyone in the room, including Grace herself, where she belonged in the hierarchy. But Grace had spent 2 years drowning in invisibility. She was done being afraid of the surface. "Dr. Grace Lin," she said quietly. Her voice carried across the room like a bell in a cathedral. "Doctor of Linguistics. Oxford University. Specialization in endangered Chinese dialects and their preservation in private cultural archives." The air went out of the room. Evan's smirk vanished. Richard's eyes narrowed. Bella sat frozen, her water glass halfway to her lips. Grace continued, her tone calm, clinical, every word a scalpel. "I spent 4 years researching the linguistic structures embedded in historical Chinese art and literature. Specifically, the collections held by families like the Zhangs, families who preserved regional dialects through calligraphy, poetry, and encoded visual language during periods of cultural suppression." She looked directly at Bella now. "Your great-grandfather's scrolls. Your grandfather's porcelain inscriptions. The private library your father digitized. I catalogued over 3,000 pieces. Traced dialectical patterns across 5 provinces and 2 centuries." Bella's breath caught. "You studied our archives?" "I didn't just study them, Miss Zhang. I helped prove their value." Grace's voice softened, but only slightly. "Your family's work isn't just art. It's linguistic archaeology. Every algorithm your father built, every design principle Zhang Innovations uses, it's rooted in patterns I helped decode and document." Richard's face had gone very still. The kind of still that comes before violence or retreat. "My dissertation," Grace continued, her gaze shifting back to him, "was going to demonstrate that the Zhang collection represented one of the most significant cultural preservation efforts of the 20th century. Oxford was prepared to offer me a permanent lectureship. My research was going to be published in the Journal of Cultural Linguistics." She paused. "And then Ashbridge Capital acquired Hetherington Fund." Bella's eyes widened. "The university's primary endowment sponsor?" "Yes." Grace's voice was steady, but something dark flickered beneath it. "Within 3 months, my program was classified as non-essential. My funding was terminated. My research was transferred to a consultant named Dr. Malcolm Tate for commercial evaluation." Richard's jaw tightened. "Dr. Tate," Grace said, her words measured and cold, is a man who couldn't distinguish Mandarin from Cantonese if his career depended on it. But he could write reports. Very profitable reports. Reports that justified gutting university programs and liquidating cultural assets for private acquisition. Bella's hand slowly moved to cover her mouth. 6 months after Ashbridge acquired the endowment, Grace continued, Dr. Tate published a valuation of the Zhang family archives. He concluded they were commercially unviable and recommended their acquisition and redistribution. She tilted her head slightly. That report is cited in Section 9 of the contract you brought tonight, Mr. Ashbridge. I recognize the language. It's my research. Rewritten to say the opposite of what I proved. The silence was suffocating. Evan looked at his father. Richard stared at Grace like she was a ghost he thought he'd buried. Bella's voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. They stole your work. They erased it, Grace corrected. Erased me. And then used what I'd built to devalue the very thing I'd spent years trying to protect. Her eyes remained locked on Richard. Your merger, Mr. Ashbridge, is built on my stolen research and a fraudulent valuation. You didn't just buy a university endowment. You weaponized it. Richard's mask finally cracked. That's a serious accusation. It's a documented fact, Grace replied evenly. I have copies. Emails. Drafts with timestamps. I kept everything. Evan swore under his breath. Bella turned to Richard, and for the first time all night, her expression wasn't polite or restrained. It was fury, cold and precise. You didn't come here to save my father's company, she said softly. You came to dismantle it. Using research stolen from the woman now serving your wine. Richard opened his mouth. Closed it. He had no answer that wouldn't confirm her accusation. Grace stepped back, her role as waitress reasserting itself out of muscle memory. But Bella reached out, not touching her, but the gesture was clear. Stay. Their eyes met. 2 women. 2 erasures. 1 system. Bella's voice, when she spoke, was a whisper, but it carried the weight of a vow. Then perhaps tonight, she said, her gaze still locked on Grace, we both stop being silent. Grace's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. It was sharper than that. It was a promise. Sometimes, the most dangerous thing in the room isn't the man with power. It's the woman he tried to bury, who kept the receipts. Isabella Zhang stood. It wasn't dramatic. She didn't slam her hands on the table or raise her voice. She simply rose from her chair with a kind of deliberate grace that made everyone in the room go silent, not because she demanded it, but because her stillness carried more weight than any shout. The chandelier light caught the sharp lines of her blazer, the set of her shoulders. She looked for the first time that evening, exactly like what she was, the daughter of a dynasty, the inheritor of a vision, a woman who had been underestimated for the last time. Mr. Ashbridge, she said, her voice calm and clear as glass, I'd like to revisit the foundation of this entire negotiation. Richard's expression hardened. Miss Zhang, I don't think. My family, Bella continued, as if he hadn't spoken, built Zhang Innovations on a single unyielding principle, that technology without culture is a tool without purpose. That innovation must honor its origins, not erase them. She placed her hands on the table, leaning forward slightly. You've spent this evening trying to convince me that principle is outdated. Sentimental. Commercially unviable. She paused, letting the words settle. But what you're actually saying is that you seek to own what you cannot understand, and profit from what you refuse to respect. Evan shifted in his seat, discomfort flickering across his face. With all due respect, Miss Zhang, respect doesn't pay dividends. No, Bella agreed softly. But fraud certainly costs them. Evan blinked. Excuse me. Bella reached into her portfolio, a slim leather case she'd brought but never opened, and withdrew a document. She placed it on the table with the precision of a chess player delivering checkmate. Section 9 of your proposed contract references a cultural asset valuation conducted by Dr. Malcolm Tate. This valuation is the cornerstone of your offer. It's the reason you believe my family's archives are worth a fraction of their actual value. Richard's eyes flicked to the document. Tate is a respected academic consultant. Dr. Malcolm Tate, Bella interrupted, her voice sharpening, was dismissed from a University of Beijing in 2019 for academic misconduct. Specifically, plagiarism. The temperature in the room dropped. That's, Richard started. Documented, Bella finished. I have the university's official censure. Published findings. Testimony from 3 separate colleagues. She slid a second set of papers across the table. He was accused of appropriating research from junior scholars, repackaging it under his own name, and selling it to private interests. Evan's face had gone pale. Bella turned her gaze to Grace, who stood just beyond the circle of light, perfectly still. Dr. Lin, would you say Dr. Tate's methodology in his Zhang archive assessment is familiar? Grace stepped forward, just slightly. Her voice was clinical, precise. I would say it's identical to the structural analysis I developed in my dissertation, down to the categorical frameworks and dialectical mapping sequences. He stole your research, Bella said quietly. He reframed it, Grace corrected. Changed the conclusions to serve a commercial agenda. My work proved the archives were irreplaceable cultural artifacts. His report classified them as redundant inventory. She looked at Richard. Same data. Opposite findings. One designed to preserve. One designed to liquidate. Richard's composure was fracturing, his mask slipping. You're making serious allegations. I'm stating facts, Bella said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it filled the room. Your entire valuation, the foundation of this merger, the justification for your offer, is built on plagiarized, falsified research. You came here with fraudulent documents and the assumption that I wouldn't notice. Or wouldn't care. She straightened, her eyes burning with quiet fury. You treated me like a signature. A formality. A polite face for paperwork you believed I was too ignorant or too Eastern to understand. Evan tried one last time. You're being emotional. Integrity, Grace said, her voice cutting through his like a scalpel, doesn't depreciate, Mr. Ashbridge. Even if you fail to quantify it. The words landed like a slap. Evan's mouth snapped shut. Bella took a breath, her gaze moving slowly across both men, Richard, whose carefully constructed dominance was collapsing in real time, and Evan, who looked like a child caught cheating on an exam. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, but somehow more devastating. My father taught me that a company is not what it owns, it's what it stands for. Zhang Innovations stands for preservation. For honoring what came before while building what comes next. She tilted her head slightly. What do you stand for, Mr. Ashbridge? Richard said nothing. You came here tonight, Bella continued, believing you would buy an empire. That my grief and inexperience would make me easy prey. That you could strip my family's legacy for parts and call it progress. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to just above a whisper. Instead, you've sold your integrity, exposed your fraud, and proven that arrogance is no substitute for substance. The silence that followed was absolute. Richard Ashbridge, the man who had commanded the room an hour ago, sat frozen. His son stared at the table, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Across the dining room, staff members who'd been pretending not to watch were now openly staring. And at the head of table 9, Isabella Zhang stood like a queen reclaiming her throne, not with a crown but with truth. Grace, still holding her tray, felt something shift in her chest. Something that had been dormant for 2 years. Power. Not over others. Over herself. Bella's voice, when it came again, was gentle. Final. This meeting is over, gentlemen. You may leave. Richard's jaw worked. Miss Zhang. Leave, Bella repeated. Before I call my legal team. And the press. Sometimes, an empire doesn't fall to armies or revolutions. Sometimes, it falls to a woman who was told to stay silent, and finally said no. The morning light that filled the 20th floor of Zhang Innovation's headquarters was nothing like the amber and shadow world of the Pacific Union Club. Here, everything was glass and clarity. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the San Francisco Bay, the water glittering like scattered diamonds. The conference room was minimalist. Clean lines, natural wood, air that tasted of possibility instead of old power. No velvet curtains to muffle sound. No chandeliers to cast judgment. Just light, honest and unfiltered. Bella arrived early, her heels clicking against polished concrete as she crossed the open workspace. Employees looked up from their stations, designers, engineers, archivists, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and concern. News traveled fast. By now, everyone knew last night's dinner had not gone according to plan. What they didn't know yet was that the plan had changed entirely. Grace stood near the window, her reflection ghost-like against the morning sky. She wore a tailored blazer the color of slate, her hair pulled back, her posture professional but no longer invisible. She looked like someone who'd spent the night remembering who she used to be, and deciding to become her again. You didn't have to come this early, Bella said gently, setting her bag on the conference table. Grace turned, a small smile playing at her lips. Yes, I did. Bella understood. This wasn't just a meeting. It was a reclamation. At 9 a.m. precisely, the elevator doors opened. Richard Ashbridge stepped out. He looked different. Still impeccably dressed, tailored suit, Italian leather shoes, but something essential had been stripped away. The swagger. The casual cruelty. The assumption that his presence alone commanded the room. He walked toward the conference room like a man approaching a sentencing. Evan wasn't with him. Bella noticed. Apparently, humility wasn't a family trait. Richard stopped at the threshold, his eyes finding Bella, then Grace. For a long moment, he simply stood there. Miss Zhang, he said finally. His voice lacked the smooth certainty it had carried the night before. Dr. Lin. The use of Grace's title, no mockery, no condescension, spoke volumes. Bella gestured to a chair across from her. Please. Sit. Richard did carefully, as if the furniture might reject him. Bella folded her hands on the table, her expression calm, professional. I appreciate you coming. I wasn't sure you'd agree to see me, Richard admitted. I wasn't sure I would either, Bella replied honestly. But my father taught me that the best solutions are built on dialogue, not destruction. Richard nodded slowly. Your father is a wise man. He is. Bella's voice softened. And he would want me to do what's right. Not what's satisfying. Grace opened a leather portfolio and slid a document across the table. Not the contract from last night. This one was new, the pages crisp and clean. We stayed up late, Grace said evenly. Rethinking the framework. Richard glanced at the cover page. His eyes widened slightly. Zhang, Ashbridge Cultural Technologies. A partnership proposal. Not a merger, Bella clarified. A partnership. Built on transparency, shared governance, and a commitment to ethical innovation. Richard scanned the first page, his expression unreadable. You're offering me a stake. I'm offering you an opportunity, Bella corrected. To be part of something that matters. To invest in culture and technology not as competing interests, but as complementary forces. Grace leaned forward. Your firm has capital and market reach. We have legacy and vision. Separately, we're vulnerable. Together, we could redefine what a 21st-century cultural tech company looks like. Richard looked up. After last night, I wouldn't blame you for walking away entirely. Or worse. Revenge, Bella said quietly, doesn't build anything. It just burns what's already broken. Richard set the document down, his jaw tight. I owe you both an apology. A real one. He looked at Grace. Dr. Lin, what happened to your research, your career? It was unconscionable. I didn't know the details, but I should have. I built my strategy on someone else's theft, and I didn't ask the right questions. Grace studied him, her expression guarded but open. Apologies matter, Mr. Ashbridge. But actions matter more. Agreed. Richard nodded. What do you need from me? Bella slid another document across the table. A public statement. Acknowledging the fraudulent valuation. Reinstating Dr. Lin's academic standing and crediting her research. And a formal commitment to the new partnership terms. Richard read through it slowly. When he reached the final page, he exhaled. Dr. Grace Lin will serve as Chief Cultural Advisor for Zhang, Ashbridge Cultural Technologies, with full authority over heritage preservation initiatives and equal voice in strategic planning. He looked at Grace. You'd work with me? After everything. Not with you, Grace said, her voice steady. Alongside you. As an equal. That's the difference. Richard picked up the pen Bella had placed beside the contract. For the first time in his career, his hand hesitated. This isn't the deal I came for, he said quietly. No, Bella agreed. It's better. Richard met her eyes. Saw no triumph there. No gloating. Just clarity. Purpose. He signed. When the ink dried, Bella extended her hand across the table. Richard took it, the handshake firm and honest. Welcome to the partnership, Mr. Ashbridge, Bella said. Thank you, Miss Zhang. He turned to Grace. Dr. Lin. Grace inclined her head. Let's build something worth keeping. As Richard left, Bella and Grace stood together at the window, watching the morning sun climb higher over the bay. We did it, Grace said softly. We did, Bella echoed. Below them, the city moved, indifferent, relentless, alive. But up here, in this room of glass and light, two women had rewritten the rules. Not with anger. With precision. Sometimes, power isn't taken. Sometimes it's recognized, and finally, given the space to build. The grand ballroom of the Bund Observatory glittered like a constellation brought to Earth. Crystal and silk, old Shanghai glamour meeting cutting-edge design. The space was a study in contrasts. Traditional Chinese lattice screens backlit with programmable LEDs. Tang Dynasty calligraphy projected onto glass walls using algorithms that made the brushstrokes dance and evolve. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Huangpu River flowed past like liquid history, the Pudong skyline rising beyond it in defiant modernity. This was not a funeral for tradition or a rebellion against it. This was a conversation between centuries. At the center of it all stood Isabella Zhang. She moved through the crowd with the kind of confidence that comes not from arrogance, but from clarity. Her qipao was midnight blue silk with silver thread constellations stitched along the collar, a piece her grandmother had worn, updated by a young designer from the Institute's first cohort. Tradition, reimagined. Dignitaries from 3 continents filled the room. Ambassadors. Tech CEOs. Museum directors. Journalists with cameras and questions. They weren't here out of courtesy or obligation. They were here because what Zhang Innovations and Ashbridge Capital had built together was unprecedented. Grace stood near the main exhibit, hands clasped loosely in front of her, answering questions from a cluster of academics with the easy authority of someone who no longer had to prove herself. She wore a tailored emerald dress, her hair swept up, a jade pendant at her throat, a gift from Bella's father, presented when he'd regained enough strength to attend last month's board meeting. He'd looked at Grace for a long time, then said in Shanghainese, Asterisk, you gave my daughter her voice back. I cannot repay that. Asterisk. Grace had replied simply, asterisk, she gave me mine. Asterisk. Now she gestured toward the exhibit behind her. Asterisk asterisk code and calligraphy, a dialogue across time. Interactive installations where visitors could watch AI systems learn classical brush techniques, then generate new works that honored the principles without copying the forms. Screens displaying endangered dialects being preserved through voice recognition and cultural storytelling apps. Holographic scrolls that unrolled to reveal the mathematical patterns hidden in ancient poetry. It was beautiful, revolutionary, and it was theirs. A reporter from the Financial Times raised her recorder. Dr. Lin, 6 months ago you were serving tables. Now you're directing one of the most innovative cultural institutions in the world. How does that transformation feel? Grace paused, considering the question with a thoughtfulness that had always defined her. It doesn't feel like transformation, she said finally. It feels like restoration. I was always this person. The world just needed to remember how to see me. She glanced across the room at Bella, who was speaking with the Chinese Minister of Culture, radiant and composed. Both of us, Grace added softly. Dinner was served at precisely 8. The tables were set with Jingdezhen porcelain, each piece hand-painted by artisans whose workshops the Institute had helped preserve. The menu fused Shanghainese cuisine with modern technique, a metaphor you could eat. Grace sat at the head table beside Bella, with Richard Ashbridge 2 seats down. He'd flown in from London specifically for tonight, and he brought something unexpected, humility that seemed genuine, worn in over months of learning to listen instead of dominate. Evan hadn't come. Some people, it turned out, couldn't unlearn their arrogance. But Richard was trying. The servers moved through the ballroom with practiced grace, young hospitality students from local universities who'd been hired and trained by the Institute as part of its community outreach program. One of them, a young man no more than 20, with nervous hands and careful movements, approached their table with a bottle of wine. He poured for the minister first, then moved to Grace. His hand trembled. The bottle tilted too far. Red wine splashed across the white tablecloth, droplets spattering dangerously close to Grace's dress. The young man's face drained of color. His eyes went wide with horror. I'm so sorry, The table went quiet. Grace looked at the spreading stain, then up at the young server. His panic was palpable, the kind that comes from knowing a single mistake could cost you everything. She'd seen that fear before. In a mirror. In Bella's eyes across a table 6 months ago. Grace smiled, gentle, genuine, and spoke in Shanghainese, her voice carrying just far enough for nearby tables to hear. Asterisk wuzi ki shidiao, don zunyin yong yuan shuyuni. Asterisk. Asterisk, a stain can be washed away, but dignity always belongs to you. Asterisk. The young man blinked, confusion and relief flooding his face. It's all right, Grace said in Mandarin, switching for the benefit of the other guests. Accidents happen. You're doing beautifully. He nodded, swallowing hard, and carefully finished pouring before retreating with a whispered thank you that cracked at the edges. Bella, who'd watched the entire exchange, set down her glass and laughed, not mockery, but recognition. Joy. That sounds familiar, she said quietly. Grace met her eyes, and something unspoken passed between them. A memory. A moment. A promise kept. History repeats, Grace said, echoing the words she'd spoken months ago in a different city, a different life. But sometimes it heals, Bella finished. They raised their glasses, crystal catching the light. Around them the gala continued. Conversations in 6 languages, laughter, the soft clink of silverware, the hum of a world being quietly rebuilt by people who refused to accept that power and decency were mutually exclusive. Later, as the evening wound down and guests filtered toward the exit, Bella and Grace stood together near the exhibit, watching the calligraphy animations flow across the screens like water. We did something impossible, Bella said softly. We did something necessary, Grace corrected. Bella smiled. Both can be true. Grace tilted her head, considering. Yes. I suppose they can. Outside, Shanghai glowed, ancient and new, restless and enduring. And inside, two women who'd once been invisible stood in the light they'd built together, casting shadows that stretched toward tomorrow. The end is not when you fall. It's when you decide whether to stay down, or stand up and rewrite the ending. Bella and Grace chose to stand. And the world had no choice but to notice. The gala had quieted to a hum below, but Bella and Grace had slipped away, climbing the narrow spiral staircase to the building's rooftop terrace, a small garden oasis most guests didn't know existed. Here, Shanghai revealed itself in layers. The Bun's colonial architecture glowed amber along the waterfront, dignified and immovable. Across the river, Pudong's skyline thrust upward in glass and steel and neon. The Oriental Pearl Tower, the Shanghai Tower, the World Financial Center, monuments to ambition and velocity. Between them flowed the Huangpu, dark and patient, carrying history forward whether the city remembered or not. The air smelled of jasmine and diesel, tradition and transformation. Bella leaned against the stone railing, her grandmother's qipao rippling slightly in the breeze. Grace stood beside her, arms crossed loosely, her eyes tracing the skyline like she was reading a text in a language she'd forgotten she knew. For a long time, neither woman spoke. They didn't need to. Finally, Bella broke the silence. My father used to bring me up here, she said quietly. When I was young. Before the company went global. Before everything became so complicated. She smiled at the memory. He'd point to the old buildings and say, asterisk, this is where we come from. Asterisk, then he'd point to Pudong and say, asterisk, this is where we're going. Asterisk, and then he'd point at the river and say, asterisk, this is what connects them. Never forget the water. Asterisk. Grace glanced at her. What did he mean? That the past and future don't exist in opposition, Bella said. They flow through each other. You can't dam the river. You can only learn to navigate it. Grace nodded slowly. He was right. He usually was. Bella's voice caught slightly. They tried to buy my family's soul, Grace. Everything my grandfather preserved, everything my father built, they wanted to strip it, repackage it, sell it as nostalgia for people who'd never understand what it actually meant. Grace turned to face her fully. And they failed. Because of you. No. Grace shook her head. Because they never saw it. They looked at your legacy and saw inventory. They looked at me and saw furniture. They confused silence for absence. She paused. But we were always there. We just hadn't spoken yet. Bella laughed softly, the sound edged with wonder and exhaustion. 6 months ago, I thought I'd lost everything. I sat in that club feeling like a ghost at my own funeral. 6 months ago, Grace said, I was washing dishes and telling myself it was temporary. That someday I'd be seen again. But I'd stopped believing it. What changed? Grace considered the question, her gaze drifting back to the skyline. A teacup fell. And for the first time in 2 years, someone needed the truth more than I needed to stay safe. Bella's eyes glistened. I heard you. In the language of my childhood. In my grandmother's voice. And I realized I wasn't alone. Neither of us were, Grace said quietly. We just didn't know it yet. Below them, the city pulsed with 10 million lives, each one fighting to be heard, to matter, to leave something behind that couldn't be erased. Bella thought about all the women like her. Like Grace. The ones dismissed in boardrooms and classrooms and dinner tables across the world. The daughters told to smile and defer. The scholars told their work wasn't marketable. The voices buried under systems built by men who mistook dominance for leadership. Do you think we changed anything? Bella asked. Really? Grace was quiet for a moment. Then, we changed ourselves. That's where it starts. And the rest? The rest, Grace said, turning to meet Bella's eyes, is just people watching and realizing they can do the same. A breeze swept across the terrace, carrying the distant sound of the river, the hum of traffic, the living, breathing enormity of a city that had survived dynasties and revolutions and would outlast them all. Bella reached out and took Grace's hand. Grace squeezed back. 2 women. 2 worlds. 1 truth. Voiceover. Cinematic, reflective, intimate. Power built on arrogance always collapses. It's loud, spectacular, inevitable. But power built on empathy? On respect? On the quiet refusal to let cruelty have the final word. That endures. This is the story of 2 women the world tried to erase. The heiress, dismissed as decoration. The waitress, forgotten as furniture. One spoke a language the boardroom couldn't understand. The other remembered who she was before the world told her to disappear. And together, they taught an empire to listen. Not with rage. Not with revenge. But with truth. And truth, it turns out, is the one thing wealth can't buy and arrogance can't bury. If you've ever been overlooked, spoken over, underestimated, dismissed, remember this asterisk. Being unseen is not the end of your story. Sometimes, it's just the first chapter. The quiet one. The one no one pays attention to. Until you speak. And when you do, when you finally use the voice they tried to take from you, you don't just change the room. You rewrite the rules. Because the most dangerous thing in the world isn't the person everyone fears. It's the person everyone forgets. Until it's too late. Final image. Bella and Grace, silhouetted against the Shanghai skyline, standing shoulder to shoulder as the city lights flicker like stars that refuse to fade. The camera pulls back slowly, rising, until they're just 2 small figures on a rooftop, invisible to the city below. But not to us. Not anymore. Sometimes, being unseen is just the first step to being unforgettable.
Thank you for watching this story. If you enjoyed this story, leave a comment below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and click the videos on your screen to watch more powerful stories just like these.